So anyhow, it's been great to get to know David, and he's been involved actually in a grant that we submitted through TriSem this year, a training grant. And so I've gotten to know him a little bit better and his research better through that, and also with some of our overlap in Duke Global Health and colleagues in Duke Global Health. And so anyhow, it's really a pleasure to have you here, David, and I'll turn things over to you. Thanks so much for agreeing to be our speaker.
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how excited I am to have this opportunity to speak with you today. I am sharing my screen, and I am an economist. I don't have a training in evolution or medicine. I rose to the ranks as an economic theorist working on traditional economic topics like auctions. And I only really began thinking seriously about antibiotic resistance in 2012. And I can actually pinpoint the day. It was June 9th. And the reason I know this is because that was the day after my youngest daughter was born. So I was in that little brief bubble of calmness that new dads have after the baby is there and before mom and baby are discharged. And I was thinking about examples for my book. As I was writing this introduction to game theory, trying to describe key ideas of game theory through stories. And I had heard about antibiotic resistance, and I understood the basic notion that when you prescribe an antibiotic, you kill the bacteria that it kills and you don't kill the ones it doesn't kill. And so obviously increased antibiotic use will drive increasing resistance. But I also understood, well, there might be things we could do to slow that process. So it's what we game theorists would call a collective action problem. So, or prisoner's dilemma, if you've heard of that. And so I thought, okay, I'll tell that story. But as I started thinking about it, I realized that the conventional wisdom about antibiotic resistance that I had learned actually wasn't complete. Okay, it relied on assumptions that have been true for the past 75 years, but may no longer be true as technologies are advancing, especially diagnostic technologies. So I suddenly had this idea, and I was like, you know what? I got to drop everything I'm doing and start working on that. Okay, especially when I realized it wasn't sort of common wisdom. This very simple idea that I'm going to describe to you just in like 1 minute. So here's the plans for my remarks, and then I'm going to leave a lot of time for discussion. So I'm really looking forward to your feedback. First, I'm going to tell the basic idea through a Farmer McGregor version of the story, okay, and how diagnostics change the game and allow us potentially to reverse selection against resistant organisms. Then I'm going to step back and sort of provide this framework of biological management, both in an economics and game theory point of view. And then I'm going to circle back to the superbugs, because the story I'm going to tell at the beginning, I just want to acknowledge, it's going to be kind of a caricature of how bacteria work, and the actual biology and the medicine is a lot more complex. Okay, so there's going to be nuances and issues that will occur to you as I'm telling my simple story. I'm going to then return to some of those, and those are the nuances that my co-authors and I addressed in one of the published papers in the announcement. And then finally have our discussion. Okay, so the simple idea, Mr. McGregor, we all know him because he has a rabbit problem, right? But he also has a mouse problem. Okay, and he has a decision to make on how he's going to control the mice, either with a cat or a trap. Okay, now he prefers to use a cat. It's less work, okay? But the cat is actually less effective than a trap. But more importantly, the cat can only catch one type of mouse, the bold mouse. The timid mouse is cat resistant. Okay, so we can think about this in the game theory way, and this is called a payoff matrix. The idea is that one player, McGregor, chooses the row up or down. You can choose cat or trap. And the mice, they don't actually decide what their genes are, but you can think about them as having a choice of whether to be susceptible or resistant to the cat. And so the best outcome for McGregor is when he can easily catch the mice with a cat. So that's the 4, that's the best. The worst outcome for McGregor is that he does not catch the mice, okay? And you can also think through the relative outcomes for the mice. Now, what happens in this game? Well, let's imagine that the population starts as mostly cat susceptible. Okay, so McGregor is going to do a cat, kill a bunch of mice, but the timid will have an advantage. And so the mice population will become more timid over time until a point is reached at which McGregor starts wanting to use the trap. Okay, now The co-adaptation dynamics continue. That's not the end of the story, but my point is that at this point in time, cat resistance is common and it will not go away, okay? Same thing with Dr. McGregor. Now, I did a Google image search. This guy actually is Dr. McGregor, okay? So, and he has a choice, drug A, drug B. You can read, there's a bunch of bullet points there that tell a story. I will save time and just, you can trust me, these are the numbers for the story I had there. They are very similar, but not exactly the same as the mouse story, but the fundamental features of this game are the same. If we start out with almost all the pathogens that cause this disease being A-sensitive, then McGregor is going to prescribe drug A. He's going to cure a lot of people. But then the resistant ones will have a reproductive advantage. And at some point, he's going to start prescribing drug B. Okay, and at that point, drug A resistance is going to be prevalent. Now, for simplicity for the talk, I'm going to focus on scenarios where drug B resistant has not yet emerged. Okay, so just to be clear on that. So now this is the sort of seemingly inevitable rise of resistance that you all know. This is standard logic that we've all learned, okay? And of course, it doesn't stop with drug A, because once drug A resistance is common and we're using drug B a lot, drug B resistance is going to enter the population or emerge spontaneously and then spread. And eventually we'll have this so-called post-antibiotic world where a lot of people have infections that cannot be treated at all. All right, but the diagnostics change the game. So information changes the game. This is the fundamental idea I had sitting on that couch in the room with my wife. So let's revisit this mouse game, but now suppose that Mr. McGregor has a way of knowing if the mouse is bold before deciding whether to use a cat. It's very simple. Bold mouse, you'll see scurry across the room in broad daylight. Timid mouse, you'll see droppings, you won't see the mouse, right? So this is plausible. And what will he do? If it's a bold mouse, he'll use a cat. If it's a timid mouse, he'll use a trap. Now think about it from the mouse's point of view. If you're timid, you're getting the worst possible outcome. You're getting caught in a trap, which is highly effective, and you're timid, so you're actually not eating as much food. That's the other part of the story. So the bold version of the mouse is at a reproductive advantage. And so over time, even as all the mice are being treated effectively, the bold will become more and more prevalent. Cat resistance is going to dwindle over time. Okay. Same thing with the bacteria. So if Dr. McGregor has a rapid resistance diagnostic at his disposal, and he knows if drug A will be effective or not before deciding whether to prescribe it, well, what's going to happen? The sensitive infections will get drug A. The resistant infections will get drug B. Because by assumption, resistance to drug B has not yet emerged, okay, what's going to happen? They're both going to be effectively treated. And as long as drug B is equally as good or better than drug A, then the A-resistant guy will be at a disadvantage. If they're equally effective, well, as long as there's any fitness costs at all associated with drug A resistance, that will also put them at a disadvantage. Okay, so you have a scenario where resistance to drug A declines over time, in the sense that the fraction of the pathogen population resistant goes down, even as all infections, all patients are getting the best available treatment for their individual condition. Okay. Now notice that what this also means is that the other part of the conventional wisdom, the economic side, is also not right. Not only is rising resistance not inevitable, also antibiotics should not be thought of as, quote, exhaustible resources. As I argue in this paper, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the discussion, antibiotics are more like air, like clean air, rather than oil. You take a barrel of oil out of the ground, it's gone forever. Okay, that's not what this story is telling us about antibiotics. Okay, now I might have lost some of you with all these matrices. No, don't worry. I have an even simpler, sillier way of explaining the basic idea. Imagine we have these cartoon pictures of our three types of pathogens. We have one version that's sensitive to all the available antibiotics, one that's resistant to the first drug, but not the second one, and the final, the superbug, that is resistant to all antibiotics. Now, if I can detect which one I'm facing, I can treat them differently. Okay, so the sensitive ones, I give drug A, send the patient home. The resistant one, I can do targeted treatment, the partially resistant one. I give them drug B, okay? So now they're also effectively treated. So they're not getting an advantage by having that resistance conferring gene. But what about the superbug? I can't treat that one at all, right? Well, I can do other things. So maybe I can do some transmission disrupting activities. Like maybe I can isolate this patient, or I can do contact tracing and identify other people with the same type of infection and kind of isolate them. Okay, so or give some supportive therapy that reduces transmission. There's a variety of things I can try to do. Moreover, it's not just infection things. Maybe there's some microbiome manipulation that I could do that could disadvantage the superbug. As long as I only do that for the superbug and don't do it for other things, that can be a selective disadvantage. And if significantly effective, could also put the superbug at a reproductive disadvantage. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And I ran with that for the last 9 years. This has been the thing I've been really focused on. The last few years, I've brought it back to economics. So there's some more traditional economics on the right-hand side of this picture, but today I'm talking about the things that intersect with evolutionary medicine. So far, I've talked to you about the game-changing impact of diagnostics from a game theory point of view. So if you were game theorists, I would summarize the previous argument by saying diagnostics change the timing of moves. They allow people to move last rather than moving first. And that is the fundamental game theory insight. Information changes the order of moves. If you're playing poker, you want the other guy to move first because that means they show their hand, and then you get to optimize against that. We want to make the bacteria show their hands, and then we can take advantage of that. All right, but I also want to say a few words about the second line of related research, which is thinking about evolution management as a game. Okay, so so this will be related but slightly different. But I want to share this with you as well. So stepping back kind of abstractly, we can think about a biological space, so where organisms live, and then we have a person who makes decisions that impact those organisms. Okay, so this biological space could be a patient, and you're the doctor, or it could be a farm, and you're the farmer, something like that. And there's a variety of things you can do as the biological manager. So you can try to kill harmful organisms. That's like an antibiotic treatment. You can also do things to try to prevent the emergence of harmful organisms. That's a topic that I explore in unpublished work with Troy Day, Andrew Reed, and David Kennedy. There's other things you can do too, like try to prevent harm, maybe with a vaccine that prevents symptoms but doesn't prevent transmission. You can also do things to try to prevent transmission directly. And each of these things is different, has a different economics and also different implications for the biology. I'm going to focus here today on the killing and the preventing, mainly the killing. Okay, so yeah, okay. So you have these decisions to make. Where does economics come in? Economics, if you can assess the benefits and the costs associated with these different options, that informs your decision making. So we need to think about incentives when we're thinking about how a biological space will be managed. But it's not just individual decisions. We are actually playing a game because there's multiple managers. So let me just explain what this word means, game. The concept of game is this ridiculously broad concept. A game is any situation with more than one decision maker, so we call them players, with the property that their decisions impact each other. So there's impacts. And we can see that both of these properties naturally hold here. There's a lot of farmers, there's a lot of doctors. They're all making their own individual decisions that all impact each other. Those impacts arise through actual biological transmission, so the organisms are moving around. They also share information. There's also economic impacts that connect them. Okay, and these interconnections, whenever you have that, you need game theory. Okay, so why do you need game theory? Well, let's think about what the nature of the impacts are. Okay, so and there's two fundamental types of impacts that can arise in games. I'm giving you a game theory 101 here. Sorry if you know a lot of game theory, this is, or you study economics, this is old hat. But the first type of impact is what I call direct impact, and the econ textbook word for that is externality. If you've heard that. So for example, when I kill harmful organisms in my biological space, I cure my patient. That helps your patient because my patient won't infect your patient. Okay, so that's a positive externality. It's something I do that benefits you, but there's no automatic mechanism that I get rewarded for that. Okay, so it's uncompensated. That's called an externality. And similarly, sharing diagnostic information, stopping transmission, preventing emergence, those all create positive externalities. And there's a role for policies that shape incentives to try to encourage people to do things that create positive externalities. Kind of more interesting from my point of view, but more subtle, are these other impacts that I call incentive impacts. Okay, so when one farmer does something, or when one doctor does something, how does that change the incentive of others to do the same? Okay, so, and I have pluses for when there's a positive feedback. So that means the more that others do the thing, the more you also want to do it. And then I have a minus for a situation where the more others are doing something, the less you want to do it. And I have a plus and a minus when it kind of depends on the context. And I, at least personally, have thought about context where it goes both ways. Okay, so what I'm going to describe to you, just to give you a taste of this, and I'm happy to talk about any of these if you're interested. Like the vaccine one is kind of topical, related to preventing harm. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the killing and the preventing emergence. Why is killing positive feedback? So let's think about malaria. Okay, so according to a 2002 study, 80% of these Malian children who received curative treatment were reinfected within 13 weeks. But if you're an American kid and you get somehow malaria, your odds of being reinfected are basically zero. Okay, so if you had a toxic curative treatment, it would, it could make sense for the American because they'll be cured for good, but it might not make sense for the Malian. So you can see that if if a disease is better controlled, there's less reinfection risk and hence more benefit from treatment, more incentive to treat, and hence better control. Okay, so that's a positive feedback. This idea is in a paper by Bob Rawthorne and Flavio Toxford, if you're interested. And what about preventing emergence? So think about a pest that damages corn crops. Okay, now, if all the neighboring farmers do a really good job of preventing emergence of the difficult to treat, difficult to control version of this pest, the BT toxin resistant one, well, what does that mean? That means that there's less of these, bad boys flying onto your field from other places. Okay, so your main risk that you face is that they're going to emerge from your own field. And since the main risk you face is that, you have more incentive to stop them from emerging from your own field, and that benefits everyone as well. So you can see that's a positive feedback. The more people are controlling these pests, the more they want to control them, or in the sense of stopping them from emerging. Okay, but there could be other impacts too. So imagine if, when other farmers better control the pests on their fields, they're able to produce more corn. Now, if that was true, more corn would go on the market, the price of corn would fall, and then people would have less incentive to manage their populations. On the other hand, if managing your pest population required you to produce less corn, perhaps because you have to rotate crops or plant a refuge, then that would raise the price and you would have more incentive to. So you really have to think through the economics to understand the fundamental nature of the game. Why does this matter? Well, because there's huge policy implications. Okay, so think about it. Imagine you have a policy that will encourage the red farmer or whatever or doctor to take some management action. Okay, so you're able to tell them what to do. Well, we have to think about, well, how will the blue respond? If we have a negative feedback, and in game theory, this is called strategic substitutability, in case you ever need that for a bingo card or something. So if you have a negative feedback, if I make the red guy do more, the blue will do less. Okay, and so the impact of my policy, I thought I was doing great. No, I get crowded out. I get less bang for buck than I thought. On the other hand, if there's a positive feedback, I make the red guy do more, the blue will respond by doing more, and that will cause the red to do more. And so we get this virtuous circle, okay, or this multiplier effect is another word you might have heard for these games, okay? The other important thing about games with strategic complementarity, this positive feedback, is there can be multiple equilibrium steady states for the system. So we could have a world where a disease is not very well controlled, and part of the reason why is no one is controlling it. But if we could switch, if we can collectively change behavior, to the better equilibrium, it can then be self-sustaining. Okay, so those are really important things to understand, and you get them by thinking about gain food. Okay, I'm almost done, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. But I just want to say a couple words about some of the nuances with the bacteria. As remember, I had this simple story about, well, you could reverse selection on resistance. Well, not so fast, not so fast. Okay, there's some challenges here. So first, for consistency with what I did before, I want to focus right now only on the case where drug 2 resistance has not yet emerged. The second drug, we're comparing the totally sensitive to the partially resistant bacteria. And all the slides here are from this paper with me, members of the Sam Brown lab, and members of the Mark Lipsitch lab. So the first green boxed area here is comparing the reproductive success of the totally sensitive strain versus the partially resistant strain if all of them are treated with drug 1. Okay, so drug 1 kills off the sensitive guy a lot, but the drug 1 resistant guy stays high. There's a strong selective pressure in favor of the resistant strain. But if we can prescribe drug 2, well, that lowers that yellow bar quite a bit. And we can do other things as well. So in this picture, of what I refer to as accelerated treatment, it's like you use contact tracing or some other method to identify infections you would have otherwise missed, and then you treat those with drug 2. Okay, and so in this picture now, there is a relatively small selective pressure against the resistant strain, because the yellow bar is below the green. Okay. Now, there's an additional bigger caveat here, which is that all this discussion so far has assumed, without me saying it, that it's an obligate pathogen, that you can immediately detect this thing. But in fact, work from the Mark Lipsitch lab showed that for many pathogens of interest, including the pneumococcus here, for every intentional exposure, like every time it causes an infection and we prescribe antibiotics to kill it, there are many times that it was exposed to antibiotics by accident, so-called bystander exposures. Okay, so in this case, it's several times more for the pneumococcus. Okay, and what that means is we're starting from a big disadvantage, even if the infections in question were never treated. The green bar is going to be much lower. So here's a figure from our paper. I'm happy to come back and talk in detail about this figure if you like later, but the x-axis is the average amount of time that this pneumococcal serotype stays in carriage. So when it colonizes a person, how long does it stay there on average? And the vertical axis is the fraction of people with sensitive infections who are treated. Okay, so the top is everyone gets treated. The bottom is we withhold infection from sensitive and we only treat resistant. The main takeaway here is, and I should say 6A is the median length. So half of them are far to the right, not even in the picture of the pneumococcal serotypes. So for most of these pneumococcus strains, there is literally no way to reverse selection on resistance. Even perfect isolation of every infection would not be enough. All right. However, there's something else that we might be able to do, because this picture is based on, again, an unspoken assumption that the only way to identify these bacteria is when they cause infection. What if we could identify them when they're just sitting there in the gut or wherever they might be? Okay, so maybe a person gets sick with something else. We could test them and see the resistant pneumococcal bacteria. Or maybe we just do an annual checkup and sort of look at your gut microbiome. And so this figure is doing that thought experiment. What if we did an annual checkup? Well, the right-hand panel here is a 2-week serotype. So like the annual checkup has almost no chance of detecting. The little red dotted line is the chances we discover, and it's almost nothing. But for that 2-week, very short carriage stay, that's like an obligate pathogen. And so the insights I shared at the beginning kind of work there. So the infection-oriented interventions can take care of that guy. But on the left, we have the type that lives in the gut for a long time. And there we have a 25 to 30% chance of catching them at the annual checkup, our imagined annual checkup. And then we say, well, once we see they're there, maybe we can do a microbiome manipulation or something. And if that has a 50% chance of working, that's what the little star is. If it has a 50% chance of working, that'll be enough to reverse selection against even this really long carriage duration opportunistic pathogen. Okay, so I know I blew through that real fast, but I'm sure some of you will come back with questions. But that is it for my remarks part. I'm happy to now open it up to comments and questions. And I'll start looking at the chat too.
We have a couple of comments in the chat from Joe Graves. And otherwise, our chat's been a little bit quiet. We'd love to hear from the audience. If anybody has any questions or comments, you should certainly raise your hand. Use the virtual raise hand function, which Meredith can explain better than I can. But it looks like we have Joe on. Joe, if you'd like to ask a couple questions, then we'll turn things over to Michael Huckberg after Joe.
So yeah, I'll make a comment because I do have some direct experience with dealing with tropical disease transmission. So when I was a grad student, I worked on schistosomiasis transmission in the Nile Delta. And they very much had the same case as the Malian case that you described in your talk, which is, you know, if you gave somebody an anti-schistosomial drug, they're going to be reinfected within 2 weeks. And so therefore, there's no efficacy to doing that, because what you need to do is actually reduce transmission. So, and this is something I've been arguing for a very, very long time with regard to tropical disease. But this then comes down to questions of, you know, who's involved and how they're thinking about how this should happen. And there's far more, at least my experience has been far more emphasis with trying to develop drugs, even though they're going to be less effective because of reinfection. So instead of changing habitats, and of course the other option is trying to develop an effective vaccine.
Well, yeah, could I build on what you just said? Because your comments fit perfectly with the framework, actually, because there was actually a list of several types of quote treatments, but things you can do. And in a environment with lots of pathogens, with very high reinfection risk, the economic actually, and so if you think the incentive is to invest more in transmission disruption, to invest more in self-protection. Okay, so stopping the arrivals is that's like getting vaccinated yourself, if it's a vaccine that prevents infection. So we can think about the path that this population will follow. When it's really prevalent, there'll be a lot of focus on preventing transmission that will reduce the prevalence of infection, but until a point is reached at which it starts making sense to do treatment. And that might actually track the schistosomiasis. I'm not an expert in that, but I believe it's come a lot more under control now, if I'm not mistaken, at least in some places, right? And so now there could be a strong incentive to be treated. So perfect. I think what you're saying really supports the importance of thinking beyond merely treatment to all the different types of interventions and how they complement each other as well.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, David. Thanks, Joe. Michael, you have your hand up. Go ahead. You are muted, Michael. There you go.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I found your talk very stimulating. I'm wondering about the missing player here, and that is the immune system or immune systems, and how that comes into play, because it would seem as though if you're able to sample microbes for your various strategies, that you could sample the immune system or immune competence and decide in terms of timing and so forth how to better optimize these kinds of approaches. The idea being that ultimately, if you're going to clear an infection, it's probably the immune system that's doing the work and not the antimicrobials. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. And this is something that the biology world, I know, has been grappling with, thinking about the immune system and pathogens as playing a game. I'm aware of some fascinating work by Andrew Reed with, I believe, chickens or some poultry that got horribly sick with the virus. And so you can, if you have, so just to summarize that idea, if diseases are more serious, the immune system will respond differently itself. And that immune system response can create selective advantages, for instance, for greater virulence for the disease. So you could actually have a game of strategic complementarity, to use a term I introduced, between the immune system and the disease to everyone's detriment. And but what you're suggesting is really interesting, that, you know, the concept of immunotherapy could be another dimension for targeted response. So if someone gets an infection, you have diagnostic information about that infection and or about the biological space, so the patient, then you can do different things, okay? And so you can not just help the patient by giving them targeted immunotherapy, but maybe you could do it in a way that would shape that fitness landscape among the pathogens, on the pathogen populations. And of course, I've been treating the pathogen as a single thing, but in fact, there are interactions between all these different microbes. And so those interactions should also be considered. Everything you do to deal with an infection, you're shifting the balance between other things as well. So you could be promoting resistance or not among the other bacteria living there. So those are all things that are complex, but in principle, we should be able to expand how we think about this to incorporate those as well.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. We'll turn now to Jude. Jude, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I was curious in your model with the mice game theory, what effect does timing to a decision or a diagnostic have an effect? And do you take that into account in your model? Like, for example, let's say it takes 2 years to get to a diagnostic versus, you know, you get a diagnostic within a week or something like that.
Really good question. Yeah, and I'll just amplify that by saying there are different categories of diagnostics. So in the disease context, you could have surveillance of the environment, which would give you an accurate belief about the likelihood a given patient has a resistant infection. And then you also have individual diagnostics that tell you 100% or close to 100%, close to 0%. So you know, the environmental surveillance is valuable. Super delays in the diagnostic can really undermine the effectiveness of the targeted treatment. In our paper, so one of the figures I didn't show, the x-axis is like how long does it take for the diagnostic to work. And the idea is that once the diagnostic says, no, penicillin doesn't work, you can then change your treatment. So you do A for a while, then you switch to B. As you can imagine, there's kind of a continuous effect. And it's tougher to reverse selection against resistance when you have longer delays. So basic takeaway from that was, though, moving from 1 day to 1 hour could be super important if it allows the doctor to make a different decision than they otherwise would. But moving from an hour to 30 minutes or 30 minutes to 2 minutes, like, that's not going to make much of an impact at all. We'd much rather invest in contact tracing capability or something like that. So you can play with these comparative stat, you can play with these parameter changes in our model to gain some insight into kind of where we should be investing as a society. A key takeaway from that paper, this is the one with the Sam Brown lab and Mark Lips's lab, is that we need basically a combination of capabilities if we're going to reverse selection on resistance. We need alternative treatments. So if you have the superbugs, the completely untreatable ones, it's really hard. It's just really hard to reverse selection. So you need alternative treatments. You need the capability to diagnose, so to rapidly, like, genetically diagnose an infection. And third, you need public health capabilities to do things outside of the hospital room and the doctor's office. You have to go into the community to do these transmission disrupting activities. And so, you know, a country like the United States, we're insanely strong on the first two, but we're actually not necessarily that great on the third. Whereas in a low resource country, they might be really strong on the third, relatively speaking. So different countries may be able to have different types of strategies to control the rise of resistance in their populations.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question. We'll turn now to Kaylin. Go ahead, Kaylin. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you so much. That's really, really cool and awesome to see game theory, and economics and evolution all in one place. It's always fun to come to these talks and see who's going to be here. So one of the questions that I'm thinking about in terms of trade-offs, which is another idea that's really obviously common in evolutionary biology, but thinking about trade-offs between the individual level and the population level. And I think you sort of touched on it with sort of, I can't remember what they were called, but the different scenarios with the pluses and the minuses. But I wonder where, if you've thought of it or what you think of where virulence fits into that and how, I guess, effects on individual people might have sort of really start to outweigh some of the other decisions. Like there might be an ideal decision, but then everybody wants their family or their friends or whatever to pull through something. So I wonder where that fits into kind of the stuff that you're talking about.
Well, I can tell you, I know enough about virulence that I could spend my whole life learning about virulence, and I have not. So with all the humility in the world, though, let me just say though that what could an economist add to the conversation about virulence? It would probably come from thinking about how virulence affects behavior, okay, of the human themselves. So, you know, one thing is they might stay home, or you might be more likely to go to the hospital, which could create different transmission opportunities. And as the previous comment came, there could be immune system issues. Virulence could be caused by the immune system. It could be the immune system might respond to it. So I think biological, like you guys are already moving in that direction and know more than me. So I'm probably not the most qualified person in this room to answer that, but that's how I would think about it and add the economics angle to it.
Okay, great question and great answer. We'll turn now to John Cliver. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Sure. So I was curious to know, I have kind of a two-part quick question, but the first one would be, is it reasonably possible to do any type of modeling when you have a treatment, like say some of the work that's being done, again, still very exploratory in phage therapy, where you have a treatment that's actively changing with the infection? Is there any way to model for that with game theory, or does that kind of start to throw the rules out?
Absolutely. What do you think? Yeah, absolutely. So there you have a treatment that co-adapts with the pathogen, right? So you can think about it as like a hide and seek game. I didn't define the game, but there's categories of games. I teach game theory to MBA students, and I have an easy to use 10. There's 10 types of games according to me, only 10. And one of them is the hide and seek. Okay, another one's Prisoner's Dilemma. But anyway, in that hide and seek game where you have something trying to kill you, if something's trying to kill you, you're going to try to evade it. When you're evading it, it's going to try to kill you a different way. So that will always have the arrows going in a cycle. And so having an adaptive treatment that automatically adapts to the target is obviously an advantage. The thing about having diagnostic information is it lets you do that adaptation before you even give the treatment. So I think that this is definitely complementary. Yeah, I think the phage therapy folks, it would be a fascinating conversation, although I haven't thought about it enough to know where that would go exactly.
Sure. Wonderful. Thank you. And the second question I had, and again, pardon me, it's a lot of economics behind this are very new to me and fascinating, absolutely fascinating. But if we were to kind of envision like a further out future, and I've heard this idea kind of thrown out before, that with every kind of mutation that some bacteria takes on or some pathogen takes on to avoid some become resistant to some treatment, that there's some burden that usually comes with that to the pathogen. Is there some asymptotic point at which a certain number of drugs would result in these games kind of not being as just on a general level? Is there do you think there's almost like a certain number of drugs where at that point there would be no need to produce more, or do you expect that to always?
As someone who also was just learning about this, when I was writing that book, I did have to grapple with this fitness cost concept. And I learned that there's plenty of cases where resistance conferring genes confer benefits. So yeah, it just so happens that a lot of the time it confers a cost. But once I learned that there's examples where resistance enhances fitness outside of the treatment context, I was just like, I'm not going to worry. I'm going to assume zero fitness costs from now on and just see, can we reverse selection without relying on fitness costs? Because the traditional argument is like, oh, there's fitness costs. Thank heavens there's fitness costs. If we just stop using this drug for a while, it'll get back to normal. No, sorry, guys. So I agree with you that fitness costs are important, but everything I said today does not rely on fitness costs. It's a man-made fitness cost. This is the way I've learned to explain it to some people. We are creating a fitness cost for the resistant guys by detecting them and then hitting them on the head. Like when that's when detect.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for those great questions. I'd love to hear if anybody else has any thoughts on the phage therapy, the first question that John asked. In the meantime, David, I'm just curious about and I'd actually like to hear as well from Andrew and Sam, in case you guys have any thoughts about what are kind of the major next steps you see in advancing this work, and in particular, is there some kind of experimental system in which you're envisioning trying to test some of these principles, and which ones, if so? What are the kind of policy angles you see, or are you at a point where you feel like some policy recommendations can be made, and what are you doing about that? Or just any other perspectives from you and Andrew and Sam, if you're willing, and anyone else about this work.
Well, let me start by saying one thing, and then if Sam and Andrew want to jump in, that would be great. One next step that's supernatural from my point of view, the work I did with Sam and others, we were exploring the feasibility of reversing selection in a pathogen population, sort of using parameters sort of gotten from the literature. Okay, so could it happen? But there's a question of, would it happen? Will people have the incentive to do what we're saying would work? Do they have the incentive to employ a diagnostic? Once they have the information, do they have the incentive to go do the contact tracing or whatever it might be? And so actually taking an economic, because that paper that I talked about had no economics in it. The first part of the talk had no economics in it. I know it seemed like it did, but the economics only came when I talked about the biological management. So I would really like to have an economic model of the reversing selection on resistance and derive the Nash equilibrium if that came. So that for me is the natural next step that I want to do. Sam or Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Hey all, that's great talk, David. I really enjoyed that, as always. Well, I was going to ask the question you just posed. I mean, you talked in your slides there about incentive feedbacks, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are currently on incentive. I mean, for doctors in deploying diagnostics. I mean, I think arguably there's some pluses and minuses there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
So there are a couple directions I'm exploring. So one, in a project with another economist, Chris Snyder, we're exploring the economics of diagnostics. So I take baby steps on this in the companion paper to one of the, well, anyway, there's a paper I have called Changing Economics of Antibiotic Discovery, where I derive a demand curve for antibiotics. But I think it would be interesting to derive demand for diagnostics too. And so what I mean by that, how much would people be willing to pay for a diagnostic? How does that depend on the prevalence of the disease? How does it depend on the availability of a treatment? So as you can imagine, having a diagnostic for A resistance becomes dramatically more valuable when you have drug B. Moreover, when you have drug B, you're using the diagnostic to whack the A-resistant bacteria on the head. So that's good for drug A. So the drug A manufacturer loves the fact that drug B exists, but only so long as there's an A-resistance diagnostic. You see where I'm going here? There are complementarities, and there's competition, and there's complementarities between all these things. And so what I think a person like me could really contribute is providing a conceptual framework to really clearly help you say, oh, this complements that. If we have a policy that's going to improve diagnostics, how's that going to impact antibiotic discovery? Will it crowd out antibiotic discovery, or will it create a virtuous circle? So all those kind of patterns you can see, but now you got to have a multidimensional mind. It's not just one action. Like, oh, if we kill more malaria, we'll want to kill more malaria. It's like, well, if we kill more malaria, how will that affect the incentive to vaccinate? And how will that affect the incentive for public health interventions? So, but my dissertation actually was on games with multidimensional actions. So I'm I'm comfortable with that sort of stuff. So that's another direction I'm hoping to take. And you can see kind of the policy implications could come out of that. And they're not obvious because they require you to have this multidimensional picture of the economics in your mind. So hopefully that made sense to people in the audience.
suppose there's a negative feedback too. I mean, if this all works very well, then you're losing diversity. There's less expectation of finding resistant strains. I doubt that's going to happen.
Yeah. But can I tell you a little bit? One thing there's no simple intuition that applies everywhere. So I'll give you one example I've been interested in recently is vaccines. So there's a common perception that as more people get vaccinated, there's less incentive to vaccinate yourself. But however, that's only true for vaccines that prevent infection. If we had a vaccine that prevented harm, but did not prevent infection, just stopped you from getting sick, you will respond to that by going out and having parties and shopping without masks on because you don't care anymore. And so that will increase the risk of everyone else suffering harm. And so that's a case where the vaccine creates a strategic complementarity. The more other people get vaccinated, the more you need to get vaccinated. But if it's a prevention-oriented vaccine, then it's a negative feedback. So, the biology, the immunology, the economics, like it all in the social context as well. So like what people are doing and why they're doing it and traditions and all this stuff. So even anthropology, so all these disciplines you kind of need to bring together to really understand how, not just to treat a patient, but how to manage the evolution of a disease and help a population. So it's like this super interesting multidisciplinary area, which is really fun for me to kind of learn about all the little pieces as a generalist.
That's great. Andrew, did you want to add anything?
I was just thinking, thanks Charlie for asking. I was just thinking, nice talk, David. I was thinking in terms of next steps. In many, certainly wealthy hospitals, there's a lot of testing already going on for resistance testing, and drug choices are being made for patient treatment on the basis of the resistance profile of the bugs. And I can't help wonder if there might be some way of actually seeing, David, if your ideas here are actually having an impact on the rate of evolution of resistance, because we must have hospitals that are more or less advanced in using that technology or more or less rapid in getting the results back to the physicians. And in those situations, we should, where the targeted treatment is working really well, we should be able to see slower spread of resistance, or maybe, as you say, even reversed.
Right.
Actually, I'd even like to do it on an individual patient basis, but I can't see physicians being keen on randomizing knowledge to no knowledge. But it must be possible to look at these different settings and say, when we're doing these very expensive tests very fast in hospital settings, is it making a difference, not just to the patient, but also to the resistance profile on the hospital?
This is a great idea. Could I respond a little? So first of all, I mean, there is, of course, some indirect evidence, like the Veterans Administration, they introduced their policy, which was different than other American hospitals. And we did see a change in the relative proportion of MRSA in those facilities. But to get to your question, like if you had an individual hospital, I mean, the good news is we economists deal with this sort of thing all the time. Like we want to understand the impact of some sort of decision, but we have no way of running an experiment. But there's techniques. So there's this thing called fixed effects, where if we have, say, different doctors, and we realize, well, this doctor more often than not prescribes physical therapy, like relative to others, and this doctor prescribes surgery more, or this one refers you to the surgeon more. Well, those differences in doctors, assuming the patients, say, arrive randomly, you can first identify differences in doctors, and you can leverage that difference to then explore the impact of the treatment, sending them to a surgeon, for example, versus. And so those are methods, those are like off-the-shelf methods from the economics. So maybe we could use some of those econometric methods to do some ideally causal analysis, because you don't necessarily need a randomly assigned experiment. The economics communities develop methods for causal inference without random assignment. So yeah, I think that would be really cool.
Okay, I might just close with one last question really about game theory, if you can help clarify something for me, David. You started off with your talk with the timid mice and the bold mice and these kind of discrete categories. And I was thinking throughout your talk of how many all the kinds of individual variation there is, especially when you're thinking about a host pathogen system. Hosts are going to vary in their response to infection for a variety of reasons. based on their immunocompetence and many other factors, their nutritional state, all sorts of things like that. As well, they're going to respond differently based on the drugs that are given. And I couldn't help but wonder, do you have to use game theory in these kind of discrete categories, or can you go to a more kind of continuous variation? Sorry if I sort of missed that as you went into the models, but I was wondering if that's if you have to make that kind of simplifying assumption that there are these discrete categories, or can you actually make use of really kind of multi-dimensional
No, yeah. So the answer
response?
is no, you don't need to have discrete. That was just a way of visualizing the key ideas. In fact, one of the examples that we kind of talk about a little bit in the PLOS biology paper with regard to gonorrhea is that in the early days of penicillin resistance, it was more of it wasn't completely penicillin resistant. It just required a higher concentration of the chemical to kill it. And so if we had had these molecular diagnostics back then, like World War I times, then we could have targeted the folks who had the slightly penicillin resistant infection. So that's like a dial. It's not a 0-1 resistant, not resistant. It's a little more. We could have increased their dose, and we could have also gone and done like specific contact tracing on those sexual networks where they were getting infected. So yeah. So no, everything could be a dial as well.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for clarifying that for me and maybe for some others.
Yeah.
This was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much, David. Really stimulated a lot of discussion. I love the interdisciplinary dimensions of all of this, and great to have some of your
and if any of you had an idea spark, run with it yourself or give me a call. I would love to. I'm happy to talk with you, or maybe there's some collaboration opportunities.
Fantastic. Okay, before we part, let's give David a round of applause. Some people were already doing that. Thank you with the virtual round of applause. I'm going to share with you our upcoming Club EvMeds. I can try to share the screen. I just pasted in there the link to it. We have, this was the great talk we heard today, David McAdams, and we have a bunch coming up, as you can see here. We have Manny Vasquez, who's going to be on next week, Tuesday at 12 o'clock Eastern time. We have Amanda Leah from Princeton. I should have said he's from UC Berkeley. After that, Molly Fox from UCLA, and then Katja Cole from Emory. So a great lineup of speakers coming to you this summer. Please do tune in, stay tuned for more information on all those talks. And please also consider attending the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health in July. And we sent some information out earlier in the chat on that. Okay, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks, David, for a great talk, and we hope to see you guys next week. Thanks.